Welcome to Stan the History Man. I'm your host, Dr. Stanley Sandler. I want to talk today about Germantown. That is Germantown, Pennsylvania, right near Philadelphia. And I'd like to one thing sort of emphasize what a wonderful place to grow up in was Germantown. What made it so good, and one of the things that made it was not planned. I think Germantown had all the things that planned communities are supposed to have and almost never do have. So I'll give you some specific examples. Germantown goes way back to the late 1600s. It was a independent, separate village from Philadelphia, which had been settled by German settlers. And it grew up well, that's the big thing. What I'm saying, it just grew up. It just grew, and it became one of the first railroad suburbs in America. And that was one of the great advantages that Germantown had. You could easily get into Philadelphia. There were two high speed commuter lines and lots of trolley cars too. And I'll talk about the Germantown trolley cars. So the for a while, actually, Germantown was the capital of the United States. Well, it wasn't. The capital was Philadelphia, but during the yellow fever epidemic of 1797 and a heat wave, all this made Germantown's salubrious heights welcome. And as a matter of fact, I knew a fellow historian, and he told me he knew a very elderly lady, and she had seen George Washington walking down Germantown Avenue. Okay. And so he said, what was he like? What do you know? They said, well, he was very tall. And that's true. And it's kind of, I have authenticity. That's the thing she noticed. Nothing historical radiance about him, just that he was very tall. So he shook her hand, and I assure you, I shook his hand too. All right. So, I say that Germantown was easy to get to, and of course that's one reason why the capital moved there briefly during the yellow fever epidemic. The other thing it had was trolley cars. Germantown Avenue. They claimed that that was the longest trolley line in America. They had it was a private company. All your transit companies at that time were private, and the Philadelphia Transportation Company. Everybody kind of hated PTC. I'm not sure exactly why, but well, sense for the trolley car ride and the subway ride. So there was actually a mayor of Philadelphia ran for on the platform to lower the fares. Yeah, the 5 cents a fare is too much, but it was so much a part. The trolley was so much a part of Germantown and Philadelphia as well. I'm sure that sometimes advertisements. Let's say for a cook or something, would say car fare included. That meant that in addition to what you got paid, you had a trolley car fare as well. So, and for the longest period of time, from about 1909 to 1955, Germantown Avenue trolley line, number 23 car, the longest in the world supposedly, was dominated by what they call the near side cars. Well, I'm not sure exactly. They explained what near side meant, but I couldn't quite follow it. But anyway, these were big barns of a vehicle. They were slow. They only had two motors. Most trolley cars had four. They had two motors. The seats were wood, and they made an awful noise. I mean, you think buses are noisy. Well, these trolley cars, they may be noisy. They don't make a stink like a bus. But anyway, they really, after a while, the near side had been around too long. And so finally, the Philadelphia Transportation Company, it was still private then, in 1948, bought about 100 new streamlined, what's called the PCC cars. It was a trolley car that was designed by a committee of the transit executives, chief executives. This was something, a car by committee, but it worked. These were high speed. They were quiet, and they were streamlined. Everybody was into streamlining by the 1940s when these came to. Well, actually, they go back. The original go back to 1930s. The PCC cars, when they came on to Philadelphia, it was like, wow, no more near sides. These beautiful we call them streamlined cars. And there were people who would pay all of a nickel to ride on, just to ride on the PCC cars for a couple of blocks and come back again. That's how popular they were. Now, of course, in Philadelphia, Germantown doesn't have its trolley line. They keep saying, "Oh, they're going to bring it back," but I'll believe that when I see it. But anyway, that was one of the things that dominated Germantown. The other thing, Germantown Avenue itself, it was basically an arcade between Germantown and Chilton for about the next 10 blocks down. It was lined with um, all kinds of stores, toy stores. There were two toy stores. I was a kid, I ought to know. There were restaurants, steak houses, um, ice cream emporia, ice cream, shops, um, bakeries. I think one of the best bakeries in the world was Bittner's Bakeries on Germantown and Worcester, or near Germantown and Worcester. They had the best sticky buns and the best rum raisin ice cream I've ever had. I think that's one advantage we had in Germantown, and probably in Philadelphia too. We had the best store bought food, um, and food and drink right there that you could go, buy in a store. Uh, the drinks that we had, of course, a soda pop was in glass bottles, and you go to the store and drink it, you paid 5 cents. But if you took it out of the store, you paid 7 cents, a 2 cent deposit. And what that meant was, of course, the kids would put a couple of pennies together, and they finally had enough for a bottle of soda. But you didn't see soda bottles laying around the way you do today with the plastic bottles, because kids would pick them up and turn them in, and then could buy another bottle of soda, or a candy bar. They were all of a nickel too. So uh, the shopping in Germantown. I talk about Germantown Avenue, which had everything. In fact, up at Germantown and Shelton, there were a number of 2, 5, and 10 cent stores. If you remember what a 5 and dime store was, and a couple of bigger emporia of clothing, fashion, that type of thing. But it's the very street I lived on, Baton Street, East Baton, I think it was. At the end of the street, there were two light, uh, I guess we call them candy stores, but you could also buy lunch meat, milk, and that type of thing. Two stores competing with each other, and it was a debate which is the better store. Then you go around the corner on the Shedecker Street, and Shedecker was kind of different from Baton. There were no trees on Shedecker Street. They chopped them all down and built row houses there. And you go to the left, and then there was a barber shop there, just a front room barber shop, old fashioned, so old fashioned, a spittoon there. Okay. Then you work your way up Shedecker Street, and there was a fairly large grocery store there. I remember they had these a big wooden barrel with Jewish pickles. I think we call them Jewish pickles. I think they're actually dill pickles. And then, of course, they weren't self-service. You told the clerk, "I want this, I want that," and then they'd weigh, and then you pay for it. Across from that grocery store was another grocery store. Okay. Remember, it had very high steps to get. Always caring about the disabled. In those days, couldn't make it up the high steps. You weren't going there. Then across from that grocery store was a pharmacy. A pharmacy then, which would have a soda fountain, of course, and you could also newspapers there, and trinkets and whatever. And that was the, you could call maybe a shopping center. And then, of course, all the merchants there extended credit, and of course you lived right there, and they knew you, you know them, and you could walk your grocery home in a wagon, let's say, down the sidewalk into to your house nearby. Um, the thing is, when you bought ice cream, you had to buy it from one of the grocery stores, or the candy stores, and then you had to rush home with it because it didn't have freezers. And then most people had refrigerators by that time. I'm talking about the 1950s, 40s and 50s. You then have to take the ice cream cubes out of your ice cream tray, put the ice cream in it, and you have to rush back in a hurry too, so melting away. Nobody had like a quart container of ice cream, and unless they wanted to eat it right away. Okay, so the shopping patterns, it was very much um, uh, uh, scattered, and it was not. They didn't have any big stores. Although I remember A&P first opened on Germantown Avenue in 1945, and they were the first store to have a automatic door. And all we kids loved that. We'd hop in and out of the door sometimes. I don't know how the manager felt about that, but that was something new and exotic, a door. And then, of course, inside the A&P was just a cornucopia of things that we'd never seen in the local grocery stores. Now, you want to talk about the housing in Germantown. Of course, that's the thing also that a planned community, always with a planned housing, scatter housing. You're not just going to have the wealthy here and the not so wealthy. Just the way, the passage. Now, again, Dayton Street where I lived, there was a big mansion at one end of it. Down to the last time I checked, it was like an old folks center, and then down the way was a row of 6-row houses, and that's where my grandmother's house was, where I spent a lot of time. And then there was further down there was from that was a house a little more expensive. They had porches and a larger front yard and a huge backyard. The backyard just seemed to go on forever. And then on the other side, there was another cluster of houses with large porches and large backyards. Nobody planned this housing, just real estate builders, speculators, whatever. I presume in those days, and we're talking the 1890s. I think actually my grandmother's house was built in 1890. All you had to do was get a building permit, I guess, and clear the land and build. So you had this, I'd say, wonderful juxtaposition of all kinds of housing styles, especially across the vacant lot from Dayton Street was Sheldon Street. I think maybe Sheldon Avenue. I don't know why I call it an avenue. But there were all kinds of housing on the I figured it was Sheldon Street. I think maybe Sheldon Avenue. I don't know why I call it an avenue. But there were all kinds of housing on the I figured later on from the 1830s, 40s, the 90s. It was a whole. It really was would be worth to have a tour. There's no tour of picturesque Sheldon Street or Sheldon Street, but it'd be worth it. The differences and it just kind of showed the domestic styles that the United States went through. It's right there on Sheldon Street. Now, the best street in Philadelphia, in Germany, and that's saying a lot, would be Rubicam Avenue. This was a street that yellow brick sidewalks, which of course was smeared over with asphalt later on, and it was lined with mansions. I mean, it must have been a place for the wealthy, and huge oaks and the branches interlocked over the yellow brick road, and then on the one side behind the houses there, you had a railroad line, one of the lines I speak about before, a commuter line, later on electrified, and then beyond that was tennis courts. The tennis courts are right behind the houses. Then the train line, and beyond that was Worcester Woods. And Worcester Woods was kind of special. It was never been logged over. It was that what you saw there was with virgin growth, and that's pretty rare in the United States. A lot of forests say, "Wow, this is the forest primeval." No, it's been logged over back 100 years ago, and it grew back again. And then at the end of Worcester Woods was one other feature, was a spring, a crystal clear spring of water, which originally been used by, legend was been used by the Indians in that area. And then in our time, people would line up with big glass jars collecting the water, because the Philadelphia Corling cocktails, we call them, were pretty bad. So, spring water was very valuable. So that Rubicam Avenue seemed to have everything, as it were. Oh, also, I should say, within walking distance of Rubicam Avenue was a stop on this electric train commuter line. So, again, Philadelphia had everything. Now, where do people work? See, again, when they plan a community, we want to have light industry here, scattered around light industry, one of the big polluting corporations. Well, for some reason, I'm not sure why, Philadelphia never had big polluting, maybe that steel mills or something like that. But what we did have, I think, was small industry and medium-sized industry, like Sears and like, what was the name of it? I can't even think of the name now, but a manufacturer, light industry, where my grandfather worked. My maternal grandfather, and he worked at Leeds and Northrop. That's the name. Some of you may know remember Leeds and Northrop. He worked there until he died in the influenza epidemic of 1918, and leaving my grandmother with four children to raise, which she did, and she also bought a house in Germantown on Baton Street. Also, I should mention that my paternal grandmother died in the epidemic of 1918. This is before the two branches came together. But that's what the number that the flu epidemic did on Germantown and Philadelphia. So the, the juxtaposition of all kinds of different kinds of housing, of different kinds of industry. I can remember right behind grandmother's house in Baton Street was a place that made cones, cardboard cones for textile mills. They wrapped the thread around. And sometimes we boys shouldn't have done. We go back on there and steal some of those cones and burn them on the vacant lot across the street or whatever. And right across the street had been a factory, but that had burned down before we got there. And there's just kind of a rubble-strewn vacant lot. But of course, for the kids, that was great. And there was a rivalry between Baton Street and Sheldon Street. And they got kind of serious, and they threw rocks at each other. I remember one elder sister, I think, carrying off her brother with blood streaming out of his head. So it was, kind of a serious business. Localism, this street, wasn't just as our neighborhood. This is our street. It's Germantown and Baton Street, and I'm sure other streets felt that way too. A local feeling. Now, sometimes that local feeling, it's sort of the underside, the darker side of Germantown. There was a pretty strong racial feeling as well. And I had heard that they had, quote, a gentleman's, quote unquote, gentleman's agreement not to sell to what they called then the colored, okay? And that was, now it wasn't anything we held up in a court of law, but again, there were no blacks on Sheldon Street or Rubicam Avenue or Baton Street. There was one street that was kind of the black street, and that was where they I guess kind of kept the black population of Germantown. Germantown also had a fair number of bars. One right around on Shedeker Street the other way. And it was, I think, the Truth for 239 Cafe. And sometimes kids would, I would say we kids, sometimes kids would sort of tease money out of drunks coming out, feeling good. I'll give the kid a nickel or a dime, something like that. So, it wasn't perfect or anything, but it was, the thing about it was that sort of everything was there that you, you could want. That is a decent place to live, a factory. Many Germantowners could walk to work. In fact, I remember there was another, I can't remember the street now, but there's a row of houses, fairly large houses with, well, not too large. They had porches, which our house in Main Street did not have. And right across was a whole string of small factories. And I would see people, getting out of the house, walking out of the house, saying goodbye to their wives and crossing the street to work in the factory. I mean, how many places have that today? They try to plan communities to have that sort of thing, but how many can really say it? You can just walk across the street to your factory or down the street on the sidewalk. Hey, we're lucky to have sidewalks anymore, all right? Well, German had plenty of tree-lined sidewalks, although tree-lined wasn't necessarily always the case. I say Shedeker Street, for some reason, didn't have a single sapling on it, but then Baton was kind of the opposite that way. The shopping, you had one way, our heavy shopping, you could call it that, we would do at Germantown, Shelton. You could take the streetcar, either an airside or a PCC car later, to Germantown and Shelton, and get what you want, and then take the car back and walk a block or two maybe with your packages. I mean, would people do that today? I wonder. But then again, you didn't have to drive all over the place to get what you had. Now, Germantown in many ways was a walking. I often hear people talk about this is a walking community like Reston outside of Washington. You can walk. Walk where? It's only houses, a few light industries, a few shops, but we had all this industry bubbling all over the place to do your shopping and so on. So Germantown had a lot to through the 1940s and 50s. I remember the end of the war in Germantown. Running up and down the sidewalk in front of our house there, and well, my grandmother's house. I was staying there during the war because my dad was went overseas in World War II, blowing a plastic whistle because you couldn't buy metal things. So way back then, there's a heavy use of plastic. Although most of course, the things you bought in that time was either metal or wood or plastic, or not plastic, anything like that. Um, it's also a few wartime memories. I wanted to have a wagon. Every kid then wanted American. What was it called? There was a big wagon. I can't think of the name now, but anyway, a big metal wagon with rubber tires. So my mother, she said to me several times during the war, "Well, for once I have some money to buy the things that you want, but I can't get them." Well, they did. They had a wooden wagon. Okay, so she bought me a wooden wagon. Even the wheel was like a solid block of wood. So I loaded all the neighborhood kids in. Look, I got a new wagon. And I went speeding down the sidewalk. The wheel split in half, and the kids all went tumbling out of the wagon. And some of the local housewives said, "What are you doing?" Because their kids were crying. I said, "Well, I guess you're not working in a war plant like my mother." And so one of the first things I did after the war was that my parents did was just buy me a real wagon. I wish I could think of the name of the wagon that everybody wanted in those days. So I lived off and on in Germantown during the war, and then I lived there in between degrees, if you will, on that house on Bain Street. So just a few things to share with you about my Germantown, and I'm glad that. Thank you for listening. Bye bye.